The moment I knew something was wrong, really wrong, was at Sarah's company gala.
I'd gone with her every year since she started working there, always the dutiful husband, shaking hands, nodding at endless architecture talk, and pretending to be impressed by some design or other.
But this time, it wasn't like the others. The architect. His name was Luke. He was tall, confident, the kind of guy who looked like he lived on a strict diet of gym sessions and designer suits. I wasn't the jealous type, but I'd noticed Sarah laughing a little too much at his jokes during the dinner. Her eyes lit up in a way that hadn't been meant for me in a while. I told myself I was imagining things. She was networking, nothing more. Then the auction began. It was for charity trips, art pieces, fancy wine, and the usual overpriced items. Sarah nudged me when a two-night getaway to Napa Valley came up. "You should bid," she said, her voice breezy. Before I could even lift my paddle, Luke raised his. He didn't just bid, he practically threw his paddle in the air. $5,000, he announced. The room chuckled, and I could see people whispering about the bold move. "Big spender," I muttered under my breath. Sarah leaned closer. "He's just showing off," she said with a shrug, but I could tell she wasn't annoyed. She was impressed. What sealed it wasn't the bidding war that followed or the way Luke kept glancing at Sarah after his victory. It was how she reacted when his name was called, and he went up to collect his prize. Her smile, it wasn't just polite or friendly. It was personal. The way she clapped, the brightness in her eyes, it wasn't for charity. It was for him. The gala felt like a lifetime ago when the truth finally came crashing in. It wasn't some dramatic revelation, no cliché forgotten phone moment, or a slip-up during a drunken confession. It started with Sarah's behavior, not just subtle shifts, but glaring inconsistencies that grew impossible to ignore. It began with her work schedule. Sarah had always been meticulous about her calendar. She'd color-code her appointments, plan weeks ahead, and keep me updated when something big came up. But suddenly, her transparency dissolved. Meetings popped up out of nowhere, always critical, always late into the evening. Her explanations felt rehearsed, thin. "You're always on call these days," I said one evening as she grabbed her coat and headed toward the door. "The lead architect on this new project is a perfectionist," she replied without looking at me. "He's pushing us all hard." I didn't press further then, but that sentence echoed in my head for days. Sarah didn't complain about her boss or the architect, not in the usual, light-hearted way you vent about colleagues. In fact, she never brought him up at all. That felt odd. A week later, I decided to stop by her office. It wasn't planned, I was in the area and thought it might be a nice surprise. I swung by with her favorite coffee and a bagel. As I walked into the building's sleek lobby, I noticed a group of people heading out for lunch. "Christopher," a voice called. It was Janet, one of Sarah's team members. I greeted her, trying to sound casual. "Is Sarah in?" Thought I'd surprise her. Janet hesitated. "Oh, didn't she tell you? She's out at a site visit with Luke today. Should be back later." My stomach tightened. Site visits were normal, but Sarah usually mentioned them. I thanked Janet and left, but something gnawed at me. That evening, I waited for Sarah to bring it up. She didn't. The turning point came a few days later when I got a call from a mutual friend, Greg. He and his wife, Emma, worked in the same industry as Sarah, and we occasionally caught up over drinks. "Hey, Chris, I just saw Sarah and her team at the Addison," Greg said. "The Addison?" I asked, confused. "Yeah, it's one of those overpriced rooftop bars downtown. Looked like they were celebrating or something." I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the Addison didn't screen work drinks. When Sarah came home later, I asked how her day had gone. "Busy," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Nothing exciting, just meetings." I paused, waiting for her to elaborate. She didn't. The next day, I called Greg back and asked if he was sure it was Sarah. He laughed, saying, "Pretty sure." Hard to miss her, man. That was when the doubts solidified into something sharper, something undeniable.
I decided to take control of the situation.
Confrontation wasn't an option yet, I needed to know more. It wasn't just curiosity, it was survival. If Sarah had betrayed me, I needed the truth on my terms.
I started paying attention. Sarah wasn't careless, but patterns are hard to hide when someone's watching. She had begun keeping her phone closer, even bringing it to the bathroom. Her wardrobe shifted subtly, new dresses, makeup, perfume that I didn't recognize. I took the next logical step, hiring a private investigator.
It felt like overkill, but I couldn't rely on instinct alone.
The investigator, a no-nonsense professional named Miller, listened carefully as I explained the situation. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to downplay my concerns.
Miller didn't indulge my optimism.
"If your gut is telling you something's off, it usually is," he replied.
Days later, Miller called me in for a meeting. He laid out everything methodically, without sensationalism.
"She's been meeting with Luke outside of work hours," he began.
"Restaurants, bars, and once at a boutique hotel downtown."
The word hotel hit me like a sledgehammer. Miller continued, showing me timestamps and photos.
There was no room for doubt anymore.
The final straw came when Miller provided audio from a restaurant where they'd been. The recorder picked up fragments of their conversation.
Luke's voice: "I don't like sneaking around like this." Sarah's response was quieter, but clear: "We have to." "Not yet, anyway."
I sat there, stunned, replaying the words in my head.
Not yet. What did that mean? Were they planning to go public? To leave everything behind?
When Miller asked if I wanted him to dig further, I declined.
I had seen and heard enough.
That night, Sarah came home as though nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and settled into the routine that had once felt so normal.
But I couldn't unhear her voice from that recording, couldn't unsee the photos of her with Luke. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Had she ever considered stopping?
I stared at her as she laughed at a TV show, wondering how she could act so normal.
Inside, my anger boiled. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was fact.
I needed to confront her, but not yet.
Timing would be everything.
I spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for the confrontation. Not because I was nervous or unsure, I was angry, and I wanted her to know it. But I also wanted to make sure that when I called her out, there would be no escape. No excuses, no room for manipulation, no way to shift the blame. The first thing I did was copy everything the private investigator had gathered onto a USB drive.
Photos of Sarah and Luke at their lunches and dinners. Time-stamped receipts from the hotel where they'd spent the night.
And that audio recording, the damning conversation about sneaking around and not yet. On the 4th night, I decided it was time. Sarah came home later than usual, offering a vague excuse about a project update that had run over. Her tone was light, as if the lie was second nature now.
"Dinner's in the fridge," I said, barely glancing up from my laptop as she walked into the kitchen. "Thanks, babe," she said, opening the fridge door.
The sound of her rummaging through leftovers grated on my nerves. It was the casualness of it, the way she acted like everything was fine, like she hadn't been systematically ripping apart the foundation of our marriage. When she came into the living room with her plate, I closed my laptop.
"Sit down," I said.
She froze mid-step, her expression instantly wary.
"What's wrong?" I said, "Sit down."
The edge in my voice must have registered because she placed her plate on the coffee table and sank onto the couch. "I know," I said, keeping my tone cold and steady. Her face didn't change at first. She blinked, tilted her head slightly, and gave me a practiced look of confusion.
"Know what?"
I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees.
"I know about you and Luke." Her expression flickered then, just for a second. A quick flash of something that looked like fear.
But she recovered fast, smoothing her face into a mask of innocence.
"Luke? What are you talking about?" I reached for the USB drive on the table and held it up. "This has everything I need. Photos. Receipts. Conversations.
Her lips parted slightly, and I could see her throat working as she swallowed. "Chris, you're being ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling slightly.
Am I? I countered. Then why don't we go through this together? You can explain to me what you were doing at the Addison with him. Or why you two spent a night at the Benson Hotel. Her hands gripped the edge of the couch, and I could see the panic rising. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice growing desperate. "Luke and I are just friends. Those dinners, they're work-related. And the hotel, that was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You accidentally booked a room together? Accidentally spent the night?" "It wasn't like that," she shouted, her composure cracking. "Then explain it to me." I slammed my hand on the table, making her jump. "Make me understand how any of this is acceptable." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Then she shook her head. "It didn't mean anything," she whispered. That was it. That was her defense. After all the lies, the betrayal, the damage, her justification was that it didn't mean anything. "Didn't mean anything," I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. "So, you're telling me you threw away our marriage, our life, for something that didn't even matter?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't know what to say," she sobbed. "Try the truth," I shot back. She lowered her hands and looked at me, her face wet with tears. "It just happened, okay? I didn't plan for this. I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I said, incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? You think that makes it better?" She started crying harder, but I didn't care. "Not this time." "How long?" I demanded. She didn't answer, just kept sobbing into her hands. "How long, Sarah?" I barked. 6 months, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. 6 months. Half a year. Longer than it had taken us to plan our wedding. Longer than it had taken us to decide on the house we'd bought together. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. "Was it just him?" I asked. "Yes," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "Why?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She hesitated, and I could see the struggle in her eyes. "I don't know," she said finally. "Don't lie to me," I snapped. She flinched but didn't respond. I stared at her, my anger giving way to something colder, sharper. "You could have talked to me," I said. "If you were unhappy, you could have told me. But instead, you chose to lie. To cheat. To humiliate me." "I wasn't thinking straight," she mumbled. "No," I said, standing up. "You were thinking just fine. You were thinking about yourself. About what you wanted. About how to keep this hidden from me." Her sobbing intensified, but I didn't let up. "This ends now," I said firmly. "You're going to tell me everything, every detail. And then, I'm going to decide what happens next." She nodded weakly, her shoulders trembling. The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. The day after the confrontation, I made a decision: if Sarah wanted to dismantle our marriage brick by brick, I was going to ensure she felt every ounce of the fallout. Her tears and half-hearted apologies meant nothing to me. Whatever guilt she felt didn't even scratch the surface of what she'd done. While she spent the night crying in the guest room, I stayed awake, meticulously planning my next steps. If she thought this was going to be a quiet, mutual resolution, she was in for a rude awakening. The first thing I did was visit my lawyer. I'd hired Emma a few years ago to help with a property dispute involving a distant relative, and she was the sharpest person I knew. When I walked into her office, she greeted me warmly, but her smile faded when she saw my expression. "I need to file for divorce," I said, cutting straight to the point. She raised an eyebrow. "Straightforward or messy?" "Messy," I replied. "As messy as it gets." I laid out everything: the affair, the evidence, Sarah's lies. Emma didn't flinch.
She nodded, jotting down notes as I spoke.
Here's the thing, she said when I finished. You can play this a couple of ways. If you want to come out on top financially and legally, you'll need to be strategic. You can't go into this guns blazing without a plan. I want her to feel it, I said. I want her to regret every decision she made. Emma smirked. Oh, she will. But you'll need patience.
The first move was to gather everything of value: bank accounts, investments, property deeds. While Sarah was still reeling from the confrontation, I combed through our finances, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Our joint accounts were the first to go. I withdrew half, transferring it to a separate account in my name. I wasn't going to let her fund her new life with the man she'd been cheating on me with.
Next, I tackled the house.
The mortgage was in both our names, but I had contributed the bulk of the down payment.
Emma assured me that with the evidence of Sarah's infidelity, the courts would likely favor me in a property dispute.
I also began documenting everything: Sarah's comings and goings, her spending habits, her late-night absences. Every inconsistency, every lie, went into a file that Emma could use if Sarah tried to fight me in court.
The second move was more personal.
Sarah's affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a betrayal of the trust we'd built with friends and family. She had relied on the assumption that I would keep her secret to avoid public humiliation.
She was wrong.
I started with her parents. They'd always adored me, and I knew they'd be devastated by what she'd done. I called them one evening, asking if I could come by to talk.
When I arrived, I laid everything out.
I showed them the evidence: the photos, the hotel receipts, the audio recording. Her mother burst into tears, while her father sat in stunned silence.
I thought you should know, I said, standing to leave. She's going to need your support, but I can't be the one to give it anymore. By the time I got home, Sarah was already on the phone with her parents. Her voice was panicked, her face pale as she realized the walls were closing in.
You told them, she hissed, slamming the phone down. They deserve to know, I said calmly. She glared at me, but there was nothing she could say to justify herself.
The third move was Luke.
I'd been debating how to handle him, whether to confront him directly or let him crawl back into the hole he came from. In the end, I decided he deserved to feel the consequences as much as Sarah did.
Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that Luke was married.
His wife, Olivia, was a schoolteacher and completely oblivious to what her husband had been up to. It wasn't difficult to find her contact information. I sent her an anonymous package containing the same evidence I'd shown Sarah and her parents.
I included a note.
You deserve the truth, even if he won't give it to you. I never heard back from Olivia, but a week later, I saw Luke's car parked outside our house. He was standing at the door, shouting at Sarah.
How could you let this happen? He yelled.
I watched from the window, a satisfied smirk on my face. Their little bubble of secrecy had burst, and the fallout was delicious to witness.
The final step in my revenge plan was professional. Sarah and Luke worked for the same architecture firm, and I knew their relationship violated the company's ethics policy.
I didn't want to ruin her career entirely, but I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. I compiled the evidence again, this time focusing on the workplace implications. I sent it anonymously to the firm's HR department.
Within days, rumors started circulating. Sarah came home one evening, visibly shaken.
They're investigating me, she said, her voice trembling.
I didn't respond. She knew better than to ask for sympathy. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Sarah's carefully constructed world unraveled.
Her parents were furious, her job was in jeopardy, and her affair with Luke had imploded under the weight of exposure. She tried to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but I wasn't interested. My focus was on rebuilding my life, piece by piece, without her. The divorce proceedings were inevitable, but by the time we reached that point, I had already won. Sarah's lies had cost her everything, and the satisfaction of watching her face the consequences was more than I could have hoped for. I should have known Sarah wouldn't go quietly.
She had already proven she could lie, manipulate, and betray.
What I didn't expect was just how ruthless she would become when she realized there was nothing left to lose. It began subtly,
almost innocently, with small acts of defiance during the divorce proceedings.
She delayed meetings, refused to sign documents without adding unnecessary stipulations, and dragged every step of the process into endless arguments. It was irritating but manageable. At first, I thought this was her way of asserting control, of clinging to the last remnants of power she held over me.
But then things escalated.
A week after our first court hearing, I started getting strange emails.
Anonymous messages accusing me of financial misconduct at my job.
At first, I dismissed them as spam, but when the messages started including details about specific projects I was overseeing, I knew this was deliberate.
The worst part? Some of the accusations were true out of context.
As a project manager, I had a certain amount of discretion over budgets. Sarah, as my wife, had been privy to many of those decisions over the years.
She was twisting normal, above-board practices into something that looked far more sinister.
I confronted her about it one evening.
"Do you think this is going to change anything?"
I demanded, holding up a printout of one of the emails.
She didn't deny it.
In fact, she looked at me with a mix of defiance and satisfaction.
"You want to destroy my life? Fine.
But don't think I'll just sit here and take it."
"Do you even understand what you're doing?" I shot back.
"If these lies stick, I could lose my job." "Maybe you deserve to," she said coldly.
That was the moment I realized she didn't care about the consequences anymore, not for me, not for herself. The attacks didn't stop there.
A week later, I received a call from a reporter asking for a comment on allegations that I had falsified expense reports for personal gain.
"Where did you hear that?" I asked, my pulse racing. The reporter hesitated. "An anonymous source. They provided some compelling documents." I hung up and immediately called my lawyer. Emma, ever unflappable, reassured me.
"It's a scare tactic," she said.
"Unless they can provide actual evidence, this won't go anywhere." But the damage wasn't just professional.
Sarah started reaching out to our mutual friends, spinning a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain. She told them I had been emotionally abusive, that I had forced her into a corner, that her affair was a cry for help rather than a betrayal.
Some friends saw through it and stayed by my side. Others weren't so sure.
The breaking point came when she targeted my family. My younger sister, Melanie, called me one afternoon in tears.
"Chris, what's going on?" she asked. "Why is Sarah saying these things about you?"
"Because she's lost her mind," I replied, already knowing what had happened. "She told Mom you've been hiding money from the family for years," Melanie said.
"That you've been using offshore accounts to avoid taxes."
I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my hands shake.
"And you believe her?" "Of course not," Melanie said quickly.
"But Mom's upset, and you know how she gets."
It took days to smooth things over with my mother, who was still reeling from Sarah's accusations.
The worst part was knowing that Sarah had done this intentionally, exploiting the one weak spot she knew would hurt me the most.
At this point, I realized I needed to go on the offensive.
I hired a cybersecurity expert to trace the emails and anonymous tips back to their source.
As expected, they all led to Sarah.
Armed with this evidence, I filed a restraining order, preventing her from contacting me, my employer, or my family directly or indirectly. It wasn't a perfect solution, she could still spread lies through back channels, but it gave me some breathing room. Next, I reached out to the friends she had tried to manipulate. I didn't try to convince them of my innocence, I simply provided them with the facts. The photos, the hotel receipts, the recording of her conversation with Luke.
Some were horrified. Others stayed neutral, unwilling to pick sides. It didn't matter.
What mattered was reclaiming the narrative she was trying to twist against me.
The most surprising development came from Luke's wife, Olivia. She reached out to me directly, asking to meet. Over coffee, she laid out her own story.
"He's been doing this for years," she said, her voice trembling with anger.
"You're not the first husband he's done this to."
We ended up comparing notes, sharing evidence, and forming an unlikely alliance.
Olivia filed for divorce shortly after, citing Luke's infidelity and misconduct at work.
Together, we submitted a joint report to the architecture firm's HR department, ensuring neither Luke nor Sarah could escape scrutiny.
In the end, Sarah's campaign to destroy me failed. My employer conducted a full review of the allegations and cleared my name.
Her attempts to smear me in the community backfired, leaving her isolated and exposed. But the damage she caused, both to my reputation and to my trust in people, was irreversible. The woman I had once loved had become a stranger, a bitter enemy willing to burn everything to the ground if it meant taking me down with her. The restraining order had given me some relief, but it hadn't stopped Sarah completely. Every time I thought she'd hit rock bottom, she found a way to dig deeper, dragging herself and everyone around her further into chaos. After her attempts to smear my reputation failed, Sarah turned her attention to the one thing she knew would hurt me most: the house. Our home wasn't just a physical structure, it was the culmination of years of hard work. We'd bought it together, renovated it, and built a life within its walls.
She knew how much it meant to me. And that's why she decided to destroy it.
It started subtly, as her previous attacks had.
Small things at first.
I noticed that a few of my personal items were missing: photo frames, keepsakes, books. At the time, I thought she'd taken them out of spite.
But then things escalated.
One afternoon, after returning from a meeting with my lawyer, I walked into the house to find a chaotic scene. Every drawer in the living room was open, their contents strewn across the floor.
Couch cushions had been slashed, leaving the stuffing spilling out.
In the kitchen, broken dishes covered the countertops. I stood in the doorway, stunned.
"Sarah?"
I called out, my voice echoing through the wreckage. There was no response, but I could hear faint noises coming from the backyard. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Sarah was standing next to the grill, feeding handfuls of my clothes into the flames. My jackets, shirts, and even some of my shoes had already been reduced to ashes. Nearby, my laptop lay in pieces on the grass, its screen shattered.
My desktop computer, the one I used for work, was similarly destroyed, its components scattered. She didn't even flinch when she saw me.
"You're back," she said, her tone unnervingly calm.
"What the hell are you doing?"
I shouted, rushing toward her. She held up a hand, a twisted smile on her face.
"Don't come any closer, or I'll toss the rest in."
She gestured toward the box of my belongings sitting next to the grill.
"Are you insane?" I demanded. "Stop this right now."
Her smile disappeared, replaced by a look of pure hatred.
"You took everything from me, Christopher. My reputation, my job, my family. You don't get to walk away unscathed. This is our house." I yelled. "You're not just destroying my things, you're destroying what we built together."
"Exactly," she said, tossing another handful of clothes onto the fire. I didn't wait for her to do more damage.
I pulled out my phone and called the police.
When the dispatcher answered, I kept my voice steady.
"I need officers at my address immediately. My soon-to-be ex-wife is vandalizing my property and burning my belongings."
The dispatcher asked a few questions, and I answered mechanically, my eyes never leaving Sarah. She didn't stop when I hung up. If anything, she seemed emboldened. She grabbed a heavy lamp from the patio table and hurled it against the sliding glass door, shattering the glass. The sound of it was deafening, and it was all I could do to keep myself from grabbing her and forcing her to stop.
"You're insane," I muttered.
She turned to me, her face flushed with rage.
"Insane? You think this is insane? You ruined my life, Christopher. You think you're the victim here, but you're not. You're just as much to blame as I am. You brought this on yourself, Sarah. Everything that's happening now is a consequence of your actions." She let out a bitter laugh. "Keep telling yourself that. Maybe it'll help you sleep at night." When the police arrived, Sarah's fury turned to desperation.
She dropped the box she was holding and backed away from the grill, her hands raised.
The officers moved quickly, assessing the scene.
One of them approached me, asking for my version of events, while the other stayed with Sarah, who was now shouting about how unfair this all was. "She's been destroying my property for hours," I explained, gesturing toward the wreckage. She smashed my computers, broke windows, and burned my belongings.
The officer nodded, taking notes. Do you have any proof?
I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of the scene when I first arrived.
That's plenty, he said, motioning for his partner to detain Sarah.
Wait! Sarah screamed as they cuffed her.
You can't arrest me for this. This is my house too. Not anymore, I said coldly. The court granted me exclusive occupancy weeks ago. You have no right to be here.
Her face twisted with rage as they led her away.
This isn't over, Christopher. I'll make you pay for this.
I watched as they loaded her into the patrol car, my emotions a tangled mess of relief and exhaustion.
After the police left, I surveyed the damage. The house was a disaster. I was still smoldering, a blackened pile of ash where my belongings had been.
Inside, broken glass, torn furniture, and shattered electronics painted a picture of complete chaos. I sank onto one of the few intact chairs, my head in my hands. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of a life I had once cherished. It was over. Truly over. Sitting in the middle of what used to be my home, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no satisfaction, just a hollow stillness. The first thing I did after the police left was call Emma, my lawyer. She's out of control, I said, my voice steady but tired. She trashed the house, smashed everything she could, and burned my clothes. The police arrested her, but I can't live like this anymore.
Emma listened patiently, then responded with her usual calm professionalism. This changes things, she said.
Her behavior strengthens your case for divorce, especially if you want to expedite the process.
It also opens the door for a restraining order to include all your shared property. We'll document everything.
She was right, of course.
Emma always was.
But the weight of it all still hung heavy on me. I thanked her and hung up, taking a deep breath as I stood in the middle of the chaos.
Over the next few days, I began to take stock of what I still had.
Most of my valuables were destroyed, but I wasn't starting from zero. My career was intact, my finances were secure, and I still had the support of people who cared about me. Friends, family, and even coworkers rallied around me as word spread about what had happened.
But the damage Sarah had done wasn't limited to the physical.
The emotional toll was harder to quantify.
And then there was the question that haunted me most: what if I had done something differently? A week after the incident, I received a call from the police.
Sarah had been released, but the charges against her were still pending. The officer explained that she had been given strict instructions not to contact me or come near the house.
The next step was rebuilding.
I hired a crew to repair the damage she had caused. The windows were replaced, the furniture hauled away, and the charred remains in the backyard cleaned up. One evening, as I stood in what used to be our bedroom, I made a decision.
The house wasn't worth saving. I called a real estate agent the next day.
I want to sell as soon as possible, I told her.
She hesitated. Are you sure? You just finished the repairs.
I'm sure, I said firmly.
I don't want to live here anymore.
As the divorce proceedings dragged on, I finally sat down with Sarah for what would be our last conversation.
We met at a neutral location, my lawyer insisted on it. Sarah arrived late, looking worn and defeated. Gone was the confident, self-assured woman I had married.
In her place was someone bitter and broken. You wanted this meeting, I said, keeping my tone neutral.
So talk.
She stared at me for a long moment before speaking.
I just want to know why. I frowned. Why what?
Why you turned on me, she said, her voice trembling.
We were supposed to be partners.
We were supposed to fight for each other.
I laughed bitterly. Partners? Sarah, you cheated on me.
You lied to me for months.
And when I found out, instead of trying to make amends, you tried to ruin me.
She looked down at her hands, silent. I gave you chances, I continued. I gave you opportunities to come clean, to fix things. But you chose this path.
Not me.
Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy.
I loved you, she whispered. I still do. I shook my head. No, Sarah. You loved the idea of me. You loved the stability I gave you. But if you truly loved me, you wouldn't have done any of this. For the first time, she had nothing to say. This is over, I said, standing up. You've done enough damage. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you won't find it with me. The divorce was finalized a month later. The house sold shortly after, and I used the proceeds to start fresh.